So let's start with the R family terminals. You're going to see one of these three variations out there: R, RC, RH, RC, RH with a jumper between them. So what does all this mean? Every heating system, every cooling system that your thermostat is going to control has inside of it a transformer that takes high voltage and converts it to low voltage for your thermostat. Thermostats with a single R terminal are designed to control systems that are just heating, just cooling, or a combination of both in one. Examples of this would be like a furnace with an evaporator coil on it, an air handler with heat strips in it, or a heat pump system. Most new thermostats come with separate RC and RH terminals, and what this is telling you is that the thermostat is capable of controlling two completely different systems, each one with its own transformer. So example of this would be your cooling system is an air handler and an outdoor condensing unit, while your heating system is a hydronic boiler or a steam boiler. Thermostats keep these two R terminals separate because we don't want to mix the circuits of two different transformers. So when you have a red wire coming from an air conditioning system landing on RC, it's only going to use that 24 volts to activate cooling related terminals like Y, Y2, G, or OB. When a separate wire is coming from your heating system and it lands on RH, that 24 volts is only going to activate heating terminals like W, W2, or E. When you have a thermostat that has a physical jumper between both of these terminals, what that jumper is doing is telling the thermostat that our heating and cooling are combined into one system and we only have one transformer controlling both, just like our single R terminal that we discussed previously. This will allow the heating terminal to steal 24 volts off of the cooling terminal to activate all the heating terminals associated with it. And this is fine because we are dealing with a single system with a single transformer that does both heating and cooling. These newer smart thermostats, they have an internal jumper already inside of them. So if you're upgrading from an old thermostat with a physical jumper between these two R terminals, you do not need to add one to the new smart thermostat. These new thermostats can detect all the wires that are hooked up to them, so it will know when to use or when not to use that internal jumper. So if you only land a single wire on that RC terminal, the thermostat's going to know either you're running a straight cooling system or you're running a combination system with only one transformer in it. And it's going to use that jumper. If you run wires to both R terminals, the thermostat's going to know you're running two separate systems and it will deactivate that jumper. One of the common mistakes I see that leaves a lot of people scratching their heads is when they're hooking up a heat-only system and they naturally presume that the wire needs to land on that RH terminal. What many people don't realize is that all smart thermostats charge their internal batteries off of the RC terminal, even if you're just running heating. So unless you're running two completely separate systems, always land that wire on RC. Now this brings us to our next problem child, the common terminal. Now, not having a common wire at all is a very common problem, and it's a little too big to tackle in this one video. I do have other videos that go deeper into this, and I'll link those below. What I'm going to focus on here is when you do have a common wire available, but it's not working. When you have two wires hooked up to each of these R terminals, that jumper is deactivated. So the only way the thermostat can charge off of that RC terminal is if the common wire is coming off of the AC system, because taking 24 volts off of one transformer and connecting it to a common on a different transformer just doesn't work. The only time using a common wire from a boiler is when you're just hooking up heating, there is no air conditioning, you land that power wire on RC, and then your common can go back to the boiler and it'll work fine. Another common problem with the common wire is when the old thermostat didn't have one hooked up, you see an extra wire there, it's blue, you think it's common, you hook it up and it's still not working. And the reason for this is because it's probably not connected at the other end at the control board inside the unit. Not all brands use the C terminal as a designator for the common. Trane thermostats, for example, often use B instead of C. So if you're upgrading from or to a Trane thermostat, just keep that in mind. Another common pain point a lot of people have is when they're upgrading a heat pump thermostat. A lot of thermostats out there will use various combinations of O, B, and C. Now, a lot of thermostats combine the O and B into a single terminal, and this is for the reversing valve in the outdoor unit to change from heating and cooling mode. Now, older thermostats used to keep these two terminals separate, so why did they suddenly start combining them into one terminal? The reason for this is because you're never going to use both on a heat pump system. All reversing valves have a default position when they're not energized. Some of them default in the heating position, some default in the cooling position. Now, a lot of the major brands out there, their reversing valves default in a heating position, which means we have to energize that valve in order to get cooling mode activated. And that's exactly what the O terminal does. It gets energized when the thermostat calls for cooling and it sends 24 volts on that O terminal. Now, for systems that have a valve that defaults in the cooling position, we have to send out 24 volts to change it over to a heating position, and that's what the B terminal is for. Thermostats that combine both of these terminals together, especially the new smart thermostats, they're going to take you through a setup process that will ask you when to energize this particular terminal. If your system defaults in the heating position, you want to energize it on cool, or O. When it defaults in the cooling position, you want to energize it on B. A lot of manufacturers kind of jumble up how they handle all the heating terminals in their thermostats. You'll see a lot of different combinations out there. WW1 is usually the least confusing for most people because this is the only one that's really uniform on most thermostats. This is basically just your straight up heat mode for furnaces, hydronic boilers, steam boilers, and so on. W2 and auxiliary are often interchangeable, kind of like the OB terminals for a reversing valve, because the W2 and auxiliary can often activate the same source of heat. They just do it in different circumstances. W2 is typically used on two-stage heating systems. So if you have a gas or a propane furnace or electric heat strips, have two banks of heat strips, this second stage will kick in when the thermostat has not reached its heating set point for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. It will activate that second stage to generate more heat to get the temperature up faster. The auxiliary terminal can also start a gas or propane furnace or electric heat strips, but it only does this on heat pump systems when your heat pump is going into a defrost cycle and a secondary source of heat has to kick in during those times. So you're either dealing with a second stage of heat or a second source of heat. One thing you want to keep an eye on when you're upgrading thermostats is that you may have an auxiliary terminal on your old thermostat, but may not see one on the new one. Both of these thermostats, for example, have W2 terminals, but no auxiliary. Both of them use the W2 also as an auxiliary. So they're still a dual terminal, they're just not labeled that way. Now, emergency heat, that can vary a little bit. On a Honeywell, you might actually see an E terminal. On a Trane thermostat, however, your emergency heat would be X2. On other smart thermostats like a Nest or an Ecobee, the auxiliary or W2 is actually the emergency heat. It's just in the programming and the logic of the thermostat itself. So if you set this up as a heat pump with emergency heat, the thermostat will energize emergency heat under certain circumstances through that auxiliary or W2 terminal. Now, the Y1, Y2 terminals, they're pretty straightforward. Most people don't have any issues with these, so I'm not really going to get into that one here. If you do have any questions, just comment below, I'll answer. The G terminal, also pretty straightforward, but I do get a lot of people asking if they can use that as a substitute for a common wire if they don't have an extra wire available. That G wire typically serves two main purposes. Number one, in cooling mode, the thermostat will activate that G wire to turn on the blower motor in the air handler. Another purpose is that a lot of thermostats, they have a setting for the fan to turn it from auto to on or circulation. That allows you to circulate air throughout the house in between cooling and heating modes. Now, if you just have a forced air furnace and no air conditioning, you can move that wire over to common at both ends, both at the control board and the thermostat, and it should work just fine because in furnaces, the control board is typically what controls the blower motor, not the thermostat. So in that case, you would only be losing the fan auto on circulation function. If you do have air conditioning hooked up, one thing a lot of people do is that they will run a jumper between Y and G at the control board inside the unit. So if the unit gets a call for cooling, that 24 volts will jump off the Y terminal to the G and also activate that G terminal without it having to come to the thermostat. At that point, you can then move both ends of that wire to common and use it. And once again, you'll only lose that fan auto on circulation function. Most of the other terminals on thermostats are 4 accessory items. These are for accessories like humidifiers, dehumidifiers, energy recovery or heat recovery, ventilation systems, and so forth. Terminals labeled L, F, A, sometimes LA. These are typically just alarms, notification of some kind, just an alert to let you know something's wrong. You'll also see terminals like U1, U2, S1, S2. These are typically temperature sensors. A lot of systems, they might take an outdoor temperature and an indoor temperature to run their programming cycles.